We're in Hebrews. Yes, still. We're closer to the end than ever before. In fact, we're in the great central section of Hebrews, and it's long and it's detailed like the whole book, and like the whole book, it's highly hyperlinked. One of the things that we've noticed as we've taught through it is that, and maybe you've noticed too, is that sometimes it feels like, man, we talked about this already, didn't we? Because the author of Hebrews, the preacher of Hebrews, is so good at like linking what he's saying, kind of like mentioning now a little word or phrase that he's going to develop later, and then later he refers with one or two words back to something that he said a lot about, but now he just says one word, and he expects you to like, okay, upload that into your head as you're reading along, and it makes for a great sermon. Just preached through as how they would have heard it the first time is spoken. Most of them couldn't read. But it's a lot different when you split it up and you're preaching about it for several weeks. That's for sure. But this week, we're wrapping up this big central section. So congratulations. You made it. Assuming you survived to the end of this sermon, you made it. So this is just an outline of where it is. There's an opening and a closing that kind of match, and you see there it goes from the end of chapter 4 through most of chapter 10. But the two big things that he's talking about in this whole time is how Jesus is like a superior high priest. That was that whole better than Melchizedek bit, right? You guys remember that? Melchizedek better than Aaron, and then. Lately, he's been talking about how Jesus offered a superior sacrifice, too. He was the sacrifice. He was the priest and the sacrifice. He offered himself. And so today, we're going to recap this and really the whole section. This slide here is kind of maybe a recap of what Tony talked about last week, right? About how Jesus' sacrifice was a better sacrifice. His blood was better than the blood of goats and rams. And it was offered in a better place in the heavenly tabernacle. And it was offered once for all and not year after year. And so like I said, he's going to conclude now and kind of recap this big section in a big crescendo, I think. So let's dive into it. You'll see how this works. All right, Hebrews 10, verse 1. For the law, possessing a shadow of the good things that are about to come, not the form of those things itself, is never able, year by year, by means of the same sacrifices which they offer, without interruption, to make perfect those who draw near. For otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Because the ones who worshipped, having been purified once for all, would no longer be conscious of sins? Like if they wouldn't be conscious of sins anymore, wouldn't they have stopped offering them? But no, in them there is a reminder of sins year after year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So, he's pointing out that in verse 1 that a few verses ago, a couple chapters ago, he talked about how the earthly tabernacle of Moses was like a copy or a shadow, an imperfect copy of the heavenly temple or tabernacle. And now he's kind of saying something similar about the Mosaic law, that it's a shadow. It's not completely what God intended at the end. It's like a step on the way. And he goes on to say that those sacrifices were not able to make perfect those who draw near. And so remember here that perfect doesn't mean, without flaws. It means just right relationship with God, being brought to completion or fullness, to the intended end, to the intended result. Those sacrifices weren't able to do that. And this phrase, I want you to just note this phrase, those who draw near, because it's going to come up a few more times. It's already come up a few times in Hebrews. It's going to come up a couple more in what we're talking about today. But it's the standard phrase used throughout the Pentateuch and Leviticus and in Numbers to talk about coming to God at the tabernacle. Like, how do you come into God's presence? The phrase is always draw near, or some translations say approach. But that's the idea, and that when you draw near, you got to bring something, a sacrifice. That's the idea in the Old Testament. So he's saying this drawing near, those sacrifices can't make those people perfect. And he says at the end that it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. He has been talking about how blood can purify and sanctify the people for a time, right? And they had to do it again every year at the Day of Atonement. He has said that, but this is the first time that he says, but it couldn't really take it away. So that's just speaking of like the burden of maybe like a guilty conscience type of thing, right? The burden of that sin. It can kind of cleanse you. It can kind of sanctify you for a time. Maybe you're feeling good for a little bit, but in the end, you're going to keep doing those things. You're going to need to be sanctified and purified again next year. And so that burden doesn't get taken away by these sacrifices of bulls and goats. And then he goes on, and he says, therefore, he starts to quote Psalm 40. He says, therefore, when he came into the world, and he's talking about Jesus' incarnation, this is how he sees these verses. It's the Spirit speaking about Jesus through the psalmist, about Jesus' incarnation. With God saying, sacrifice and offering you did not want, but a body you prepared for me. You did not delight in whole burnt offerings and offerings for sins. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the roll of the book it is written about me to do your will, O God. This is this anointed figure, this Messiah figure, right, whom we know is Jesus now, but at the time they were hearing from the Spirit about this and writing all these things down, but they heard and discerned this, that God didn't want sacrifices and offerings, really, that wasn't really the thing that he wanted. And this anointed figure says, but a body you prepared for me, and I've come to do your will. And the idea that God wasn't really after the sacrifices and the offerings is throughout the Old Testament. It's not like this is the only place or in this psalm that it's mentioned. It's a common motif that what God was really after was their heart. And that was really the thing that wasn't working. You could get the external, but at best, you could get the external. And so then the author of Hebrews goes on to explain what he just said. He says, now when he says above sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin you did not want, nor did you delight in, which are offered according to the law, then he has said, behold, I have come to do your will. So he sees like a sequence in time here. And he says, he, Jesus, takes away the first in order to establish the second, by which will we are made holy through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. This is the first time he starts bringing up the body, Jesus' body. This is a body you've prepared for me. And I've come to do your will. And so he sees in these verses a a discussion and a prediction of what was going on. That Jesus had come to do God's will and offer himself as a better sacrifice. Verse 11. There we go. And every priest stands every day, serving and offering the same sacrifices many times, which were never able to take away sins. But this one, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God, from now on waiting till his enemies are made a footstool for his feet. For by one offering he has perfected for all time those who are made holy. Remember, this is him recapping what he's been saying for the last several chapters. And he points out this distinction, and he quotes again from Psalm 110, verse 1, the most quoted Old Testament verse in the New Testament, and quoted or alluded to. Here he's just alluding to it. And he points out that, the priests, they're always standing and offering sacrifices, and they got to continue standing up to offer sacrifices. But Jesus offered one sacrifice and then sat down. And he sees there that the significance of that is that Jesus' work is complete. Don't got to stand up again to offer any more sacrifices. I'm sitting down. It's done. It's finished. One sacrifice for sins for all time. And then this curious phrase, he has perfected for all time those who are made holy. I was telling Scott, I remember first reading that, noticing. It wasn't the first time I'd read it, but it was maybe the second time I'd read it. But the first time I noticed that phrase, I was a teenager. He's perfected for all time those who are made holy. Say what? Seems like a contradiction. Like if they're still being made holy, isn't that the same thing as what perfect means? Is you're holy? So if he's already made them perfect, why are they made holy? What's he talking about? So I'll remind you that as we've said a few times here, the word perfect is a decent translation for this, but it can cause a lot of confusion because now we tend to think of perfect as, morally flawless, right? And in Bible context at least. But the word just means like fulfilled, complete, made whole, brought to its final intended end, which is kind of the same idea behind perfect, right? If it's perfect, you don't need to change it anymore. It's come to its end, its final, the end of the road. There's nothing, no more change or improvement that needs to happen. But the idea of fulfillment, of completion, of wholeness is a little bit of better idea to have in your head when you see that word teleos is the word underneath in Greek. It's the same word when Jesus said, "Therefore be whole or complete as your Father in heaven is whole. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," in the Sermon on the Mount. And so he's saying, you notice that it's in the past tense, right? This perfected, but made holy is a present tense, but kind of like a timeless tense, right? Because he's talking, made holy in Hebrews has always to do with the forgiveness of sins, cleansing from sin. And so with one offering, he's brought to completion for all time everybody who is made holy. Each generation, each person throughout time, when they accept Jesus and they accept what he did for them, they enter into that state of holiness. And you guys have, I think, been around long enough to realize, we've talked about this many times, there's this like tension, the here and not yet tension in the kingdom, where that's our position, that's our standing, but we're also still like growing into it. And I think that from someone who sees the end from the beginning, like God does, there's not a lot of difference when something is still in process versus knowing that this is where it's going to be at the end. But there is a difference to us, isn't there? As we're walking in the middle of it. So then he goes on in this last kind of bit of this recap to mention one last thing, and he's referred to this verse before, but he's going to kind of paraphrase from it again. It's from Jeremiah chapter 31, but he talks about how the Holy Spirit is testifying through this scripture. This is the covenant that I will decree for them after those days, says the Lord. I'm putting my laws on their hearts, and I will write them on their minds. He also says, their sins and their lawless deeds I will never remember again. Now, where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer an offering for sin. If sins are like truly forgiven, then no more offerings needed. And that's his recap of everything that he's been saying. He brings us back to the fact that Jesus made a better sacrifice in a heavenly place, and that is eternal, once for all time. So before we go to the final crescendo where he really starts calling them to action, let's just talk about this a little bit. I know sports metaphors don't always play well to everybody, but really this applies to anything that requires skill. But in sports, they often talk about the fundamentals of a game, the basics. Something's going wrong with a team, or the team has an unexpected result, like normally they're better than that, but this game they just did terrible. What happened? You'll often hear coaches talk about, well, we didn't have the fundamentals right. If it's a football game, they'll say, yeah, we are blocking and tackling. If it's baseball, they might talk about hitting and fielding the ball and their pitching. If it's soccer, they might talk about passing and marking your man. If it's golf, they might talk about the fundamentals of your swing. If it's tennis, they might talk about your forehand or your backhand or your foot placement. You get the idea. And like I said, I know sports metaphors might not be your thing, and maybe they are, but if they're not, I think you get the idea, and this really is the same thing that can be said for any skill, right? When the more complicated stuff starts going wrong or isn't happening the way it's supposed to be, usually 99% of the time, the reason is that the fundamentals, the basics, are getting a little out of order, a little out of whack. And so we've been talking about a lot of fundamentals and basics throughout this. For most of us who've known the Lord for a long time, this isn't something that like, oh wait, he died for my sins? Oh, it's not news. But it's good to stress it. And Jesus asked us to remember these things because the fundamentals are important. It's what gives us a root, right? What was his concern in his parable of the sower, or maybe parable of the seed is a better name, where there's a seed that fell in a thorny place, and it took root, but then the thorns rose up and choked it out. Or it took seed in a rocky place, but then heat came and it didn't have a root, and so it didn't last. The fundamentals, the roots, are important. So here they are. We have a representative in heaven who's not an ordinary person, but Jesus, the anointed Son of God. He has direct access to God, and he lives forever and can provide an eternal guarantee for the promises that he's made us. And when he intercedes, he's, as a priest, he's also a king. So what he asks for, he gets. He's the one making it happen. His intercession is effective. And what he accomplished on our behalf isn't something temporary either. It's complete and it's final. He didn't just cleanse our sins for now, and maybe you got to come back in another year or month or day. But he's taken away that burden for all time. And not only that, but he's fundamentally transformed our hearts into people that are actually able to follow his law. I mean, it's great to have forgiveness of sins and to have that burden lifted. But if that's all I have, if I'm still relegated to, well, I still can't follow his law, but at least I have forgiveness, that's not really a complete, great picture, is it? But no, he's actually given us victory over the sin and fundamentally transformed. The thing that the Old Testament keeps rehashing, that there's something wrong with us at our core, that try as we might, we can't follow God's laws. He fundamentally changed us into people who can by his work on the cross. And he's made us whole forever. We're able to dwell in God's presence continually. We don't have to take a break to get sanctified, get holy, get cleansed. Like we can be in his presence 24/7. Those are the basics that if you start, when life starts beating you up, when you're struggling for the millionth time with some sin that you just can't seem to stop, when you're wondering if you're really going to have the provision that he said he was going to give you, when you're wondering why God seems so far away, why he doesn't seem to hear you. The fundamentals. Whatever you're feeling or experiencing, it's still true that you have direct access to God all the time. I'm not saying your feelings aren't what you're feeling. Like you still may feel like he's not answering you. And it's okay to wrestle with that and ask God about that. But the fundamentals are still true, which is that you have 24/7, 365, uninterrupted, no commercial breaks, access. No pay-per-view, access to God. All right. And now, just listen to this. Read along, but if you're updating your Instagram status for a second or looking at a text, I just want you to listen to this. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence for the entrance into the sanctuary by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he inaugurated for us through the curtain, that is, his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us approach with a true heart and in full assurance of faith, our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for the one who promised is faithful. And let us think about how to stir one another up to love and good works, not abandoning our meeting together as is the habit of some, but encouraging each other, and by so much more as you see the day drawing near. Isn't that wonderful? I wish I could write like that all the time. I probably write like that 2% of the time. He hasn't been talking about all this since chapter 4, for 6 chapters, for no reason. He's been talking about this and letting them stew on it and letting us think about it and ingest it and examine it from different angles so that he can say this. Because of everything I've been saying, let's approach with confidence, with a true heart. Let's hold fast. Remember, he's writing to a group that is struggling and wondering, is this the right move, following Jesus? He says, let's hold fast and let's consider about how we can spur on each other. So let's talk about a few things here. First, sanctuary, verse 19. Since we have confidence for the entrance into the sanctuary by the blood of Jesus. This is just a metaphor. He's been talking about the sanctuary, right? The tabernacle, the most holy place, all that. So he keeps using that language. But he's not talking about a physical place or time that we have to enter into. He's talking about just God's presence that's available to us all the time. Right? That's what we sang about it earlier. Fire and wind, come do it again. Pentecost. That's what that image is communicating. That just like the fire and the cloud came down when they inaugurated the tabernacle for the first time, just like the cloud came down on Solomon's temple and they had to they couldn't stand in God's presence to sing, to worship. But now, there's little tongues of fire on every believer. Now, we're all that temple. We're all that place where heaven and earth touch down, meet, overlap. We're the ones walking around spreading Eden goodness wherever we go. That's the sanctuary that he's talking about. And he says it's by this new and living way, inaugurated, something that Jesus initiated. And he has this interesting metaphor here, through the curtain that is his flesh. It's just kind of an interesting way to put it and think about it. Makes me think of the covenant in the Old Testament, the covenant animals torn in two, and Jesus' body broken, and the veil torn in two when he died. He inaugurated us through the curtain that is his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, this is a hyperlink back to verse 5 and 6 of chapter 3, where he said that Moses was a faithful servant in all the house of God, but Jesus is a faithful son over the house of God. And he starts talking about how Jesus is better than Moses in chapter 3. That's a hyperlink back to that. A great high priest over the house of God. Let us approach. That's that same word, draw near, approach. It's language of entering into God's presence. The standard Old Testament language for drawing near to God. And he wants us to do it with a true heart, true, just sincere, authentic, real, not just on the outside. but from your heart, you're coming towards him. You're approaching him. And he says, by the way, those hearts have been sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies have been washed with water. Some see a reference to baptism there. It's not really. He's been talking about this in Hebrews because he's thinking about Leviticus. And in Leviticus, there's two things that can happen to you. You can sin, and you need to be sprinkled with blood to be atoned for. And you can be impure, which is not necessarily a sin. Things like touching dead bodies and all that. And there's rituals around that, but they all involved bathing with water. And we've been given both of those, right? Being in an impure state is not wrong in itself, but like waltzing into God's presence while in an impure state, that's the problem in Leviticus. One of the problems he's dealing with. But we don't have to deal with any of that because we've been sprinkled with his blood and our bodies have been washed in water. I absolutely think that that's why they highlight blood and water flowing from Jesus' side when he was pierced with a spear. Verse 23, let us hold fast. I don't know about you, that's one of those, maybe from movies I've watched or stories I've read, that's just one of those words that really speaks to me, holding fast. I can just think of like being buffeted around in some storm or something, you're holding on for dear life. Cling is a good word. It says in Kings that Hezekiah clung to the Lord when he was going through all the stuff he was going through. And he's saying here, we got to just cling to our confession. The confession is a declaration, right? Something you say. Our confession of hope. Hope is the thing that you're expecting. A joyful expectation of something good. That's what hope is. It's not optimism. In fact, a lot of times people in the Bible that are hopeful don't have a really good reason to be optimistic. It doesn't look like things are going to turn out well. But hope says that there's someone that I can trust in for something good and something better, even if I have little optimism that it's actually going to happen. But I trust and I hope, and I have this joyful expectation of something good, and it involves waiting too, because sometimes that plays out in the long term. That's why you got to hold fast to this declaration. Why? Because he who promised is faithful. He didn't say you're going to get this and then just not going to come through. And then he ends with exhorting them to think. Here's where I like this translation. I use it a lot lately in my sermons, but this Bible translation. But here I think that think is a little bit too bland. Most translations say something like consider. And the Greek word under that is not just think. It's like it has a preposition in front of it that like reinforces it. So it's like immerse yourself in it. Like really examine it, like study it. Like consider it closely. It's not just a passing, I wonder what I could do. No, like think about it, meditate on it, figure it out, study it, come up with a way. Maybe test run it. If that doesn't work, try something else, tweak it, right? Come up with how you can stir one another up. The word stir there is most of the times used in Greek in a negative connotation, like getting somebody angry, getting them riled up, you know. But here it's a lot more neutral or positive of how you're going to like stimulate someone to love and good works. The two things that the Bible sees as the same thing. You can't say you love if you're not loving, doing the actions of love. And if you're doing the actions, it's because it's coming from somewhere. But they're in a place where they need encouragement. And so he says, yeah, think about it. Like, think about how you can be that encouraging word to somebody. It's not just by happenstance. Like, oh, if they happen to mention their problems, and if I happen to have something good to say, it like involves some preparation too, probably. Right? How could I what could I say to that person? What could I give them? How could I pray for them? How could I exhort them? Like, what would it take for me to be the catalyst, the one that like stimulates them to greater love and to greater works? He's not talking. It doesn't matter where your love and your works are. He's not talking about that. Like, oh, this only applies to people who aren't doing much or who aren't loving much. No, wherever you're at, there's times when you need somebody to come alongside you and spur you on. We've talked about it tons of times. The fact of the matter is that walking in community is how this works. Because you can't encourage yourself a lot of times. You just, maybe sometimes you can kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but there's always going to be a time where you need somebody else to encourage you, to spur you on. And so that's why he mentions the thing about, don't abandon your meeting together. This verse has been abused a lot to say you got to make every church meeting, or you got to make the church meetings. That's what this verse means. Oh, you didn't make it to the meeting. Well, Hebrews 10 says you should not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. And there are problems if you disconnect yourself from the body of other believers. But he's not talking about missing a meeting. He's talking about you stop associating. You don't come together anymore. And you're withdrawing yourself. And of course, we should do this all the more as the day draws near. So, just because I think it's cool, the main reason, but I think you'll appreciate it. This is why they call this section of Hebrews, this big central section of Hebrews, because it's bracketed off verbally. He has the same words at the beginning as at the end. He says some things that are different, but he's using tons of the same words, and you see it there in chapter 4 and in chapter 10, the part that we just read in chapter 10. Talking about a priest that we have who's gone into the heavens and holding fast to our confession and approaching in confidence. And he talks about all these things in both places. Just the order is jumbled up a little bit. And the vantage point is different. The vantage point is different because he's introducing those topics in chapter 4. But by chapter 10, he's talked about these things for a while. And so, whereas in chapter 4, he says, oh, we should have confidence, or we can have confidence. Now in chapter 10, he says, oh, since we have confidence, right? Sorry, like he's saying, I've proved to you that we have a good reason to have confidence, so let's just assume that we have confidence. Whereas at the beginning, he's talking from a vantage point of, hey, this is true. And I hope over the next chapters to convince you, right? And whereas before he's talking about Jesus has gone into the heavens. Now in chapter 10, he's talking about how Jesus has opened the way for us to go into the heavens. We're brought in along with him. So the fancy word for this is an inclusio. It's where you verbally bracket all. You say kind of something similar at the beginning of the end. And because they didn't have chapters or paragraphs back then, right? This is scroll technology, which is you take pieces of animal skin and you dry them out and you sew them together into these long pieces that you can roll up and you start writing. And it's expensive. And so you get a special guy named a scribe who can write really small because you don't have space to waste. And there's no paragraphs marking. It's just all, and in the New Testament's written in Koine Greek, where there's no punctuation. It's just all. So what do you do to kind of say this is a paragraph, or this is a section, or this is a chapter, or this is well, you do things like this. You mark it off by kind of repeating some ideas. All right. So, here's where I want to land the plane. There's 3 let us statements in that last bit. 3 things that is encouraging us to do. One is to approach with a true heart, right? True is sincere, real, authentic. So, let me ask you, are you approaching with a true heart? What is it you yearn for, you desire, when you're approaching him? Are you approaching in a genuine way, or are you holding back? Our faith isn't something that's got to be based on emotions, but if it doesn't touch our emotions, then there's a problem. Like, our emotions are part of what we are and who we are from God. And he's saying we should approach with a true and genuine, authentic heart, which involves the things that we desire and yearn for being molded by him. There's a line from a song that I really like, and I just found out in preparing for this sermon that it's actually from a longer quote by A.W. Tozer, which kind of made sense if you've read any of his work or you know about his work. Because, oh yeah, it figures that it would come from him. But here's A.W. Tozer's statement: to have found God and still to pursue him. Right? You found him, but you're still going after him, is the soul's paradox of love. It's scorned by the too easily satisfied religionist, but it's justified in the happy experience by the children of the burning heart. I don't know if that language is too flowery for you, but not for me. I love it. Let me say it again. To have found God and to still be pursuing him is the soul's paradox of love. Scorned indeed by the too easily satisfied religionist, but justified in the happy experience by the children of the burning heart. To have found him and still be looking for him. To realize that there's more. That we're always approaching him. We're always going in deeper. As C.S. Lewis said, always further up and further in. There's always more to probe. Are you approaching him with a true and sincere heart? Second one, hold fast to the confession of our hope. To what are you committed? How much are you committed? Do you realize that this walk, you have to be resolved for a long obedience? Especially the younger you are when you meet Jesus. But it doesn't matter. Even if you're 70 or 80 when you first meet Jesus. Life has enough to throw at you. Jesus said each day has enough worry of its own. I'm like, yep. Mama said there'd be days like this. So, what are you committed to? Are you resolved to a long obedience, or to quote Eugene Patterson, a long obedience in the same direction? It's not an instant discipleship. It's not add water and poof, disciple. To what are you committed to? And then lastly, considering how we can stir one another up. Who are you walking with? Who are you walking with? There's metaphors and examples and cautionary tales that abound on the dangers of, doing things alone versus with somebody, right? From Ecclesiastes to Aesop's fables to, it's all over the place. We know this is true. But what are you doing about it? Who are you walking with? Is there somebody in your life that can tell you no? Is there somebody in your life that you can share something really difficult with? Are there people that you can encourage? This isn't just, you can reciprocate, right? It's not just one way. Who are you walking with? Who are you encouraging to be committed? Who are you thinking about? I'm going to strategize how I can do something that will propel them into a greater love, into a greater acts for Jesus. Who are you walking with?